The rain came down in sheets over the iron gates of the Valente estate, turning the long driveway into a river of black mirrors. Elara Moreno stepped out of her battered van and pulled her leather tool bag across her shoulder, the weight familiar and grounding. She was a broad woman, soft in the belly and thick in the thighs, with hands that looked too gentle for the work she did. People always said that. They saw her round cheeks and the dimples that appeared when she concentrated, and they assumed she spent her days baking bread or arranging flowers. They never guessed she could read a lock like a poet reads verse, that her fingers could trace the inside of a keyway and feel the story of every pin and spring. The guard at the gate was a slab of a man in a black suit, his earpiece glowing faintly. He looked her up and down, his mouth twitching. "You're the locksmith?" "That's right." Elara's voice was calm, unhurried. She'd learned long ago not to waste energy on other people's disbelief. He snorted. "You don't look like you could crack a piggy bank, lady. This is a serious house. The boss's private office door is jammed. We need someone who can handle high-security hardware, not someone who's gonna cry if she breaks a nail." Elara smiled, a slow curve that didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised what these hands can do. Now, are you going to let me in, or do I call Mr. Valente and tell him his guard is delaying an emergency repair?" The guard's smirk faltered. He muttered something into his sleeve, and the gate groaned open. Elara walked through without looking back, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the mansion's towering facade. The Valente house was a monument to old money and older violence, a sprawling stone beast with ivy crawling up its ribs and warm light bleeding from every window. It should have felt inviting. Instead, it felt like a held breath. Inside, the foyer was a cathedral of marble and shadow. A chandelier dripped crystals overhead, but the light seemed to pool on the floor rather than fill the space. More guards lined the walls, their faces carved from the same hard stone as the house. A woman in a severe black dress approached, her heels clicking like a metronome. "Miss Moreno? Follow me. Mr. Valente is waiting." Elara followed, her tool bag bumping against her hip. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her, the guards, the staff, the portraits of dead Valentes glaring down from gilded frames. She kept her spine straight and her gaze forward. She'd been in rich houses before, but never one that felt so much like a cage. The hallway leading to the private office was narrower, the walls paneled in dark wood. At the end stood a cluster of men, 3 guards in suits, a younger man with a tablet clutched to his chest, and a figure who could only be the boss himself. Luca Valente was tall and lean, with silver threading his black hair, and a face that had seen too much too young. His eyes were the color of winter storms, and they fixed on Elara with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "You're the locksmith," he said. It wasn't a question. "Elara Moreno. You called about a jammed door." One of the guards laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This is who they sent? A plus-size girl with a bag of toys? Boss, we should have called the guy from the city. This one looks like she'd get stuck in the keyhole." The other guards chuckled. Luca didn't. His gaze flicked to the guard, and the laughter died instantly. "Enough. My father's old office door seized this morning. No one can get it open. The lock is antique, custom-made, decades old. I need someone who understands old mechanisms, not some brute with a crowbar." Elara stepped closer to the door. It was a heavy thing, oak reinforced with iron bands, the kind of door that was meant to outlast empires. The lock plate was brass, tarnished with age, and the keyhole was an ornate oval. She ran her fingers over the metal, feeling the faint scratches, the wear patterns, the tiny dents that told a story only she could read. "This isn't a standard pin tumbler," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. It's a lever lock. 5 levers, maybe 6. And there's something else. She pressed her palm flat against the door and closed her eyes. The wood was cool, but there was a vibration beneath it, a faint hum of tension. The door isn't just jammed, it's been rigged. Luca stepped forward. Rigged how? I need to examine it more closely. Can someone bring me a strong light and a magnifying glass? And I'll need everyone to step back. This could take a while. The guard who'd laughed earlier crossed his arms. She's stalling. Probably doesn't know what she's doing. Elara ignored him. She knelt by the door, her knees pressing into the thick carpet, and opened her tool bag. Inside were not the modern pick guns and electric tension wrenches that most locksmiths carried, but an array of antique tools. Long, slender hooks of tempered steel, handmade tension bars with carved wooden handles, a set of skeleton keys that had been forged in the 1800s. She selected a thin probe and inserted it into the keyhole, her movements slow and deliberate. The lock was a masterpiece of paranoia. As her probe slid past the first lever, she felt the resistance of a false gate, a trick designed to make a picker think they'd set the lever when they hadn't. She navigated past it, counting the levers, mapping the internal geography. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a 6th, hidden behind a spring-loaded curtain. She smiled. Whoever built this lock was an artist. But there was something else. Deeper inside, beyond the levers, she felt a secondary mechanism. It was a deadbolt, but not one operated by the key. This one was controlled by a separate trigger, something that had been activated from the inside. She withdrew her probe and sat back on her heels. This door wasn't designed to keep people out, she said quietly. It was designed to keep someone in. The silence that followed was absolute. Luca's face went pale. What do you mean? There's a secondary locking mechanism. It's been engaged from the inside. Someone is in that room, Mr. Valente. Or was. One of the guards scoffed. That's impossible. That office has been empty for 20 years. No one's been in there since the old boss disappeared. Elara looked up at him. Then how do you explain the fresh pressure marks on the lock plate? Someone's been trying to get out. Recently. Luca's jaw tightened. He turned to the guards. Get me a sledgehammer. Now. No, Elara said sharply. If you break the door, you could trigger whatever trap is built into the mechanism. Some of these old locks have anti-tamper springs that will permanently seal the door if forced. Let me work. She turned back to the lock, her mind racing. She'd read about locks like this in her grandfather's journals. He'd been a locksmith too, back in the old country, and he'd written extensively about the paranoid designs of wealthy families who feared betrayal from within. A lock that could imprison as easily as it could protect. A door that became a cell. She selected a different tool, a curved pick with a diamond tip, and began the delicate work of disengaging the secondary mechanism. The room behind her was silent, except for the rain hammering against the windows. She could feel Luca's gaze on her back, heavy and unreadable. She could feel the guard's skepticism curdling into something else, unease, maybe, or fear. Minutes passed. Her fingers moved with a precision born of years of practice, her sense of touch so refined that she could feel the individual ridges of each lever, the microscopic give of each spring. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The secondary mechanism was complex, a series of interlocking pins that had to be depressed in a specific sequence. One wrong move, and the lock would seize permanently. Then she heard it, a sound from the other side of the door. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Morse code. She froze. Someone's in there. They're signaling. Luca was at her side in an instant. What are they saying? Elara listened, her ear pressed to the wood. The tapping was weak, desperate. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. Then a pause, and more taps. She translated aloud. HELP, TRAP, PED, DYING. Luca's hand slammed against the door. "Father?" His voice cracked. "Father, is that you?" The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, it resumed. YES. The room erupted. The guards were shouting. The man with the tablet was frantically typing, and Luca was pressing his forehead against the door, his shoulders shaking. Elara forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to be swept up in the drama. There was a man dying on the other side of this door, and she was the only one who could reach him. She worked faster, her tools dancing in the lock. The secondary mechanism was yielding now, the pins sliding into place one by one. She could feel the deadbolt beginning to retract, just a few more millimeters. And then the door swung open. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. A figure lay crumpled on the floor, a gaunt old man, with a wild white beard, and eyes that burned with a desperate light. He was dressed in the tattered remains of what had once been a fine suit, and his hands were raw and bloody from years of clawing at the door. Luca rushed past Elara and fell to his knees beside the man. "Papa! Papa! It's me! It's Luca!" The old man, Giovanni Valente, the patriarch who had supposedly abandoned his family 2 decades ago, reached up with a trembling hand and touched his son's face. "Luca," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He locked me in. My own brother. He said I was a threat to the family. He took everything." Elara stood in the doorway, her tools still in her hands, and watched the reunion. The guards had gone silent. The man with the tablet had dropped it on the floor. Somewhere in the mansion, a door slammed, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that the uncle who had controlled the lie was already running. But that wasn't her concern. Her concern was the old man on the floor, who was now sobbing into his son's shoulder, and the lock she had just picked, which had been designed by a master craftsman to be unpickable. She looked down at her tools, at the worn handles and the polished steel, and felt a quiet pride settle in her chest. She had opened more than a door tonight. She had opened a grave and let the dead walk free. The hours that followed were a blur of paramedics and whispered conversations and the distant wail of police sirens. Elara found herself in the mansion's kitchen, a cup of cold coffee in her hands, while the staff bustled around her with wide eyes and hushed voices. No one laughed at her now. No one even looked at her directly, as if she had become something other, something untouchable. Luca found her there an hour later. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his posture was straighter than before, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Miss Moreno," he said, and his voice was hoarse. "I owe you an apology. My men disrespected you. I should have stopped them." "It's nothing I haven't heard before," Elara said. "How is your father?" "Alive, barely. The doctors say another week in that room and he would have been gone." Luca sat down across from her, his hands clasped on the table. "He told me what happened. My uncle, my father's brother, he staged the disappearance. He convinced everyone that my father had run off with a mistress, that he'd abandoned the family. Then he locked him in that office and sealed the door. He's been running the Valente empire ever since, lying to me, lying to everyone."
"And the lock?" Elara asked. "Who designed it?"
"An old locksmith, a man named Arturo. He made all the locks for this house, back when my grandfather was alive. He was a genius, they said, but he disappeared too, around the same time as my father. I always assumed he'd retired." Elara set down her coffee cup. "Arturo Bianchi?" Luca looked up sharply. "You know the name?" "He was my grandfather's mentor. My grandfather taught me everything he knew. and he learned it from Arturo. I recognize the design of that lock. It's a Bianchi pattern. The false gates, the secondary deadbolt, the anti-tamper springs. I've studied his work my whole life. Luca stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, incredulous sound. So you're telling me that the only person who could have opened that door was the granddaughter of the man who built it? Something like that. Fate, Luca murmured, or something crueler. He stood up and extended his hand. Miss Moreno, I'm in your debt. Whatever you want. Money, a job, anything. Name it. Elara shook her head. I don't want your money, Mr. Valente. But there is one thing. Name it. I want to meet Arturo Bianchi. If he's still alive. I want to learn from him, the way my grandfather did. Luca's expression flickered. That might be difficult. As I said, he disappeared. Then help me find him. You have resources. I have questions. And I think we both know that a man who designed a prison like that didn't just vanish into thin air. Luca was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. I'll make some calls. In the meantime, you'll stay here as my guest. I won't take no for an answer. Elara wanted to refuse. She wanted to go back to her cramped apartment and her quiet life, and her workbench cluttered with half-dissected locks. But she looked at Luca's face, at the grief and the hope, and the steel beneath it all, and she found herself nodding. All right, for a few days. The guest suite they gave her was larger than her entire apartment. She slept fitfully, her dreams full of turning keys and slamming doors, and the sound of an old man tapping out a desperate message. When she woke, the rain had stopped, and the mansion was bathed in pale winter sunlight. She spent the morning in the library, a cavernous room lined with books that smelled of leather and time. She was examining a display case of antique locks, Valente family heirlooms, each one a work of art, when a voice spoke from behind her. You have a good eye. She turned. An old man stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane. He was thin and stooped, with a face like crumpled paper, and eyes that were sharp and dark and full of secrets. Arturo Bianchi, she breathed. He smiled, a thin curve of cracked lips. And you must be Elara Moreno. Luca told me about you. He said you opened the door. I did. Impossible, Arturo said, but there was no malice in his voice, only wonder. That lock was my masterpiece. No one should have been able to pick it. My grandfather was Marco Moreno. He studied under you in Naples before the war. He taught me everything you taught him. Arturo's eyes widened. Marco, little Marco. I remember him. He had the touch, that boy. The same touch you have, I think. He limped closer, his cane tapping against the marble floor. I've been hiding in this house for 20 years, you know. In the East Wing, in a room that doesn't exist on any blueprint. Luca's uncle kept me here, just like he kept Giovanni. He needed me to maintain the locks, to keep his secrets sealed. I was his prisoner too, in my own way. But you're free now, Elara said. Free. Arturo laughed, a dry, rattling sound. I'm an old man. I don't know what freedom means anymore. But I do know one thing. He fixed her with his sharp gaze. You have a gift, Elara Moreno. A gift that should not be wasted. Stay here. Let me teach you what I know. There are things about locks, about the art of them, that I never wrote down, that I never taught anyone. Secrets that will die with me, unless I pass them on. Elara's heart hammered in her chest. This was what she'd wanted, what she'd dreamed of since she was a girl, sitting at her grandfather's knee. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected, a flicker of connection, of recognition, that went beyond locks and keys. Arturo was looking at her, not just as a student, but as an equal. as someone who could carry his legacy into a world that had forgotten the beauty of old mechanisms. "I'll stay," she said, "for as long as it takes." The days that followed were a revelation. Arturo was a demanding teacher, his standards impossibly high, but Ilara met him challenge for challenge. They worked in a workshop he'd set up in the East Wing, a cluttered space full of half-finished locks and ancient blueprints, and the smell of metal polish. He taught her about tension and torque, about the music of pins falling into place, about the philosophy of security, and the psychology of those who sought to breach it. "A lock is a conversation," he told her one afternoon, his gnarled hands guiding hers over a complex mechanism. "Between the maker and the breaker, you must learn to listen to what the lock is saying. Every scratch, every wear mark, every fraction of a millimeter of give. It's all part of the dialogue." Ilara listened. She listened with her fingers and her ears and her instincts, and slowly she began to understand. She wasn't just opening locks anymore. She was reading them, the way a musician reads a score, the way a poet reads a verse. And as she learned, she watched the Valente family rebuild itself. Giovanni grew stronger, his voice returning, his eyes losing their hollow desperation. Luca stepped fully into his role as the head of the family, rooting out the remnants of his uncle's influence with a cold efficiency that reminded Ilara of the locks she studied. Precise, unforgiving, and utterly effective. The uncle himself had vanished, but rumors swirled that he'd been found in a safe house in Sicily, that justice was coming for him in a form that had nothing to do with courts or lawyers. One evening, Ilara found herself on the mansion's terrace, looking out over the gardens. The moon was full, casting silver light over the hedges and fountains. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Luca approaching, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. "I thought you might want some company," he said, offering her a glass. She took it. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. Then Luca spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said, about opening more than a door." It was just a turn of phrase. "No." He turned to face her, his gray eyes intense. "You opened a door that had been sealed for 20 years. You freed my father. You exposed a lie that had poisoned my family for decades. And you did it all with nothing but your hands, and your mind, and a bag of old tools." He paused. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, Ilara." Her cheeks flushed. "I'm just a locksmith. You're more than that. You're a key. You unlock things that other people can't even see." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him. Cedar and wine, and something darker, something dangerous. "I don't want you to leave." "Not ever." Ilara's breath caught. She'd felt the tension building between them for days, a slow, simmering heat that she'd tried to ignore. She was a plus-size woman, from a working-class background, and he was a mafia boss, with blood on his hands and an empire at his feet. They made no sense together, and yet, when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her want to stay. "I'm not the kind of woman who belongs in a place like this," she said softly. "This place belongs to you now," Luca said. "You saved my father. You saved my family. Without you, I would have spent the rest of my life believing a lie." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against hers. "Stay, not as a guest, not as an employee. Stay as whatever you want to be." Ilara looked down at their joined hands. She thought about her cramped apartment, her quiet life, her workbench cluttered with locks. She thought about Arturo's lessons, about the secrets she was learning, about the legacy she was carrying forward. She thought about the way Luca looked at her, not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as an equal. "I'll stay," she said, "but on my terms. I'm not going to be some ornament on your arm. I have work to do. Arturo is teaching me things that no one else in the world knows. I'm going to become the best locksmith this family has ever seen." Luca smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his stern face. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The weeks turned into months. Elara's reputation grew, not just within the Valente family, but beyond it. She became known as the woman who had opened the unopenable door, the locksmith who could read mechanisms like a clairvoyant read palms. People came to her with their impossible locks, their ancient safes, their mysterious mechanisms, and she solved them all. She was no longer the plus-size girl with the gentle hands. She was Elara Moreno, the keymaster, the lock whisperer, the woman who saw what others couldn't. And through it all, Luca was by her side. Their relationship deepened slowly, a slow-burn romance, built on mutual respect and shared secrets. He never tried to control her or cage her. He understood that her freedom was as essential to her as the air she breathed, and she understood that his darkness was not a flaw, but a facet, a part of him that she could accept without trying to change. One night, as they lay together in his bed, the moonlight streaming through the windows, he whispered against her hair, "You opened more than a door, Elara. You opened me." She turned in his arms and kissed him, her heart full. "Maybe that's what locksmiths do," she said. "We don't just open locks, we open people." Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the mansion walls, and somewhere in the east wing, Arturo Bianchi was sketching a new lock design, his gnarled hands steady with purpose. The Valente estate was no longer a prison. It was a home, full of light and life, and the quiet hum of mechanisms that worked exactly as they were meant to. And Elara Moreno, the plus-size locksmith who had been laughed at by guards, was now the woman who held the keys to it all. The central hall of the mansion had never been so silent. It was 3 months after the door had been opened, and the Valente family had gathered to formally acknowledge the return of Giovanni and the exile of the uncle who had betrayed them. The hall was packed with relatives, allies, and associates, all dressed in black and gold, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. Elara stood near the back, her tool bag still slung over her shoulder out of habit. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, that hugged her curves without apology. She'd considered not coming, but Luca had insisted. "You're part of this family now," he'd said. "You belong here." Giovanni Valente stood at the front of the hall, leaning on a cane, but standing tall. His voice, when he spoke, was strong and clear. 20 years ago, my brother locked me in a room and told the world I was dead. He stole my life, my family, my legacy. But I am not dead. I am here, and I am alive, because of one woman." He turned and looked directly at Elara. "Elara Moreno, come forward." Elara's heart pounded as she walked through the crowd. The same guards who had laughed at her now stood at attention, their faces blank with respect. The same staff who had whispered behind her back now bowed their heads. She reached the front of the hall and stood beside Giovanni, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on her. "This woman," Giovanni said, "opened a door that was designed to never be opened. She saw what no one else saw. She heard what no one else heard. And she freed me." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "From this day forward, she is under the protection of the Valente family. Any harm that comes to her is harm to us. Any disrespect to her is disrespect to us. She is one of us now." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elara saw Luca standing at the edge of the dais, his eyes shining with pride. She saw Arturo in the corner, his cane tapping a quiet rhythm of approval. She saw the guards who had mocked her, their faces pale and their postures stiff. Giovanni continued, My brother thought he could bury the truth. He thought he could lock it away and throw away the key. But he forgot something. He forgot that there are people in this world who know how to find keys that don't exist. People like Alara Moreno. He turned to her. Do you have anything to say? Alara looked out at the crowd. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her to love locks. She thought about Arturo, who had taught her to understand them. She thought about Luca, who had taught her that she was worth more than she'd ever believed. I'm just a locksmith, she said, her voice steady. I open doors. That's all I've ever done. But sometimes, opening a door means more than just turning a key. Sometimes it means letting in the light. Sometimes it means letting out the truth. And sometimes it means freeing someone who's been trapped in the dark for far too long. She paused, and the silence in the hall was absolute. I'm honored to have been able to open this door, and I'm honored to be here with all of you today. But I want you to remember something. Locks are not just about keeping people out. They're about who you choose to let in. And the Valente family has chosen to let me in. I won't forget that. The hall erupted in applause. It was not the polite, restrained applause of a formal gathering, but a raw, emotional outpouring that shook the chandeliers and echoed off the marble walls. Alara stood in the center of it, her tool bag still on her shoulder, and felt tears prick at her eyes. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the wine began to flow, Luca found her on the terrace again. The moon was full, just as it had been on that first night, and the gardens were silver and shadow. You were magnificent, he said. I was terrified. That's what made it magnificent. He took her hand. My father meant what he said. You're one of us now. Forever. Forever is a long time. Not long enough. He pulled her close, and she let herself be pulled. His lips found hers, and the kiss was slow and deep, and full of promises that didn't need words. When they broke apart, she laughed softly. You know, when I got the call about a jammed door, I thought it was going to be a routine job. Maybe a stuck deadbolt, maybe a broken key. I never expected all this. Neither did I, Luca said. But I'm glad it happened. I'm glad you're here. Alara looked out at the gardens, at the moonlight, at the mansion that had once been a prison and was now a home. She thought about all the doors she had yet to open, all the locks she had yet to pick, all the secrets she had yet to uncover, and she thought about the woman she had become, not just a locksmith, but a key that could unlock anything, if she only had the courage to try. So am I, she said. So am I. And somewhere in the East Wing, Arturo Bianchi put the finishing touches on a new lock design. A lock that would be his final masterpiece. A lock that only one person in the world would be able to open. He smiled to himself, his old fingers steady, and began to sketch the name he would engrave on the brass plate. Alara Moreno, the woman who opened more than a door,